Wildfire challenges us somewhere every day. Our departments and crews are responding to more fires with greater complexity, our communities are experiencing larger and more destructive fires, and associated losses continue to rise. In this podcast, we'll explore all of this with the people who are experiencing wildfires firsthand. We'll talk about leadership and technology on the front lines, hear stories about that which responders are experiencing on the ground. We'll talk to the people in our communities that are creating innovative solutions, and we'll expose heroes doing great things before, during, and after these fires. We welcome you to Wildfire Chronicles, Heroism Beyond the Flames. We're with Chris Anthony this morning. Thanks for being with us, man.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have got a long, distinguished career, and you did a lot of years in what I consider sort of a preeminent fire department in the U.S., if not the world, Cal Fire. Tell us about your experience and your background.
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks so much. So before I start, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on the show, and then also to International Association of Fire Chiefs for this technology summit. There's been so much time and effort that has gone into it. And these are absolutely the kinds of events that we need to have to advance technology in the fire service. And it's so great to see that there's so many what I would call early adopters that are here that are pushing technology forward. And so Cal Fire, I know you've had a long and distinguished career as well, and we're continuing to move forward. So I actually, surprisingly, didn't plan on being in the fire service. And I studied forestry at Berkeley and worked in resource management positions in Cal Fire. Cal Fire is the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and worked in a number of resource management positions from about 1993 to 2001. And then I had a fire chief that was absolutely intent on me moving into fire protection. And you don't say no to the chief. And at the time, I actually wasn't all that interested in moving into fire protection. I had had all the training and certainly worked in that system. But looking back, it was the best thing that could have happened for my career. And really what I was able to do is I was able to carry that resource management training and understanding of the environments and the ecosystems that we're working in, and really seeing that change that was occurring with the way that wildfires were burning in the landscape and impacting communities. And so although, my education wasn't in the fire service, I really think that my education in resource management and forestry was really helpful in being able to understand this wildfire problem that we're now facing in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so I had an opportunity to work in a number of different positions, including fire protection training. I went into fire prevention, became a law enforcement officer with the state of California with Cal Fire, which was absolutely a remarkable opportunity to be able to do that. Moved into administration, and then went into fire protection position as a division chief up in the Lake Tahoe Basin. And during that time, I got moved down to Sacramento to oversee the governor's tree mortality task force. We had about 60 million trees that had died throughout the Sierra Nevada, and really trying to understand how to work with counties and bring a statewide approach to dealing with this massive issue of immense amounts of dead and down material throughout all of these communities. And that really gave me insight into how Sacramento works. And then came back to Tahoe, actually took a job in Sacramento. And I'd always sworn that I would never go to Sacramento. I mean, I would drive by there all the time. I'd be like, I will never work there. But, you get to that point in your career where you feel like you could do something different and contribute in a different way. And so moved into a wildfire resilience position, did that for a short amount of time before moving into our assistant deputy director of cooperative fire protection, in charge of training, safety, EMS, our hand crew program, and all of our cooperative agreements. And keep in mind, at this point in time, things had really changed in the way that fires were burning in the landscape. And I had noticed that change about 2012. It seemed like things were really shifting. And during the course of my career, just when you think of what's happened since the beginning of 2000, we've had 19 out of 20 of our largest fires in the state of California, and we've had 18 out of 20 of our most destructive fires in California. And so there's this lived experience, right, of seeing these changes and not fully understanding what's going on initially. And by the time I became an assistant deputy director with the department, I was tired. We were all tired. This was 2018, 2019. And the department was tired, really tired. We had seen a number of really big fire years. There really wasn't a break. It didn't seem like we were being stretched in ways that we never had been before. So I made the decision to retire. And at the time, I had been going through the process of interviewing for the director's position and the chief deputy director position. I pulled out of that process and stepped out of my job, was just burning time. And I realized that when I stepped out of that position, I didn't have a plan. I did not know what I was going to do next, and realized that I had made a mistake. But I also didn't, at that point, I really didn't think that I had any options. And so a couple months went by. Joe Tyler, a good friend of mine who I've worked much of my career with, ended up getting the director's position with CAL FIRE. Super thrilled for him. He's been such a good leader for the department. He approached me and asked if I would be interested in moving into the chief deputy director position of the department, which is an appointee position. So that means the governor has to approve the appointment. So I had to do a little bit of damage control to re-enter that process again, but I had a lot of support in a lot of different places. And my final position with the department was, without question, the best job I had with CAL FIRE. And I was just so honored to be able to do that job, and so privileged to support all of the women and the men of CAL FIRE, because it is a remarkable organization and very mission-driven, mission-oriented. The service that CAL FIRE personnel give it's just remarkable.
Pretty awesome experience. And I guess I would say non-traditional. When you think of fire service folks, we all think we're suppression first, and you came from a resource management. What a cool non-traditional route. You had said your last job was, I think you had said, one of your favorites. Was that because of the impact it had? Was it because of the content? What made that position the one that really was the one?
Two things. One is I was in a position to be able to essentially support nearly every program in the department. And CAL FIRE has a very large executive team. There's about 20 people on the executive team. And it was just such a privilege and an honor to be able to, work with all of the different programs and the people that were giving so much of themselves to these different programs, and just being able to support them in their work. That's what made the job so remarkable. And also being able to touch all of those programs and support the direction that they were going. It's a highly committed group of people that sacrifice a lot, both personally and also professionally, to do those jobs. So you just have to, get them the resources that they need and give them the support that they need to do what they know they need to do better than I do. Yeah. And being able to see how it all works together until you get into Sacramento, the place that I never wanted to go.
The mythical Sacramento.
Yes, you really understand, this is how it works. And then also I really enjoyed working with all of my different counterparts from different agencies. I really enjoyed working with the Natural Resources Agency, which is kind of the umbrella organization that CAL FIRE works under. I saw how much the governor's office supported CAL FIRE, and then also how much the legislature supported CAL FIRE. I mean, CAL FIRE would not be where it is today in terms of its size and growth and the resources that it has to do its mission if it wasn't for the support of the administration and the legislature and also the public. So I never, ever, ever took that for granted. That, that trust that you build at those levels is so critical. And admittedly, CAL FIRE in previous years, had some rough times, and like any large organization does. And so you want to make sure that you're always maintaining that trust and building that support for your department.
Yeah. So you were 27 years, I think you said, with CAL FIRE. So you went through a transition of when it was known as CDF, or Cal Department of Forestry, and then into CAL FIRE. As a resource first person, did that shake you? Were you going, oh my gosh, we're CAL FIRE? Was this a non-issue for you folks in the organization?
Yeah, so it never bothered me. The reason that CAL FIRE exists as an organization ultimately is to protect 31 million acres of state responsibility area in California. And that also includes the communities that exist within those state responsibility areas. But it is CAL FIRE's tie to the watersheds of California that really give it its mandate and jurisdictional responsibility. Otherwise, why would it exist? You could argue that any fire department could do what CAL FIRE does then. And that philosophy around the department was something that one of our predecessors, his name was Raymond Clark, back in the 1930s, he saw that there was a lot of inequity in the way that the fire service and fire service delivery was being offered throughout the state of California. And so he really argued for the state of California to take on wildland fire protection on behalf of the entire state, whereas most other states, the direction that they were going is they were delegating that down to the counties. And when World War II started, there was concerns about attacks on the West Coast from the Japanese, and mainly attacks that involved, some sort of fire. And as a result of that, he pitched to the governor then that the state needed to take on this much broader responsibility for wildland fire protection, and he got the support for it. And that was really the cornerstone or the anchor point for CAL FIRE to be who they are today. And granted, we're a much different organization than we were in the 1930s, but you would never see, a $25 million Black Hawk helicopter in Siskiyou County if it wasn't for CAL FIRE being in these rural communities, because those rural communities couldn't afford those kinds of fire protection systems. So ultimately, he realized that in order to have equity in the way that we look at fire protection throughout California, the state needed to take that leadership role and provide the resources, not based on what a community could afford, but based on where that risk was throughout the state, which I look back at that and he was way ahead of his time.
Really?
And so that was really the birth of the department, and why it is different than what you see with other forestry departments throughout the United States.
No, thanks for that context. This is good learning. So I'm going to go back to your history. So you had said, I think 2019 was the start of your first retirement, sometime in there, and then you were brought back in. And you had said you had a realization that you didn't have a plan, which I think is so common with a lot of us who are getting the tail end of our public service career. I'll tell you now, Chris, something went on that's positive between 2019 and your departure, because you certainly seem to have a plan now. Everybody wants your time, which is, I think, a pretty flattering thing. You're doing a lot post-retirement, post-real retirement, post the actual leaving of CAL FIRE. Seems like philanthropic groups all want time with you. It seems like academia is ringing your door. What are the things you're doing post-government that maybe carry on the tradition that you've developed for many years in CAL FIRE?
Sure. So when I went into my last position, I knew that immediately that I had to have a plan coming out of the department, because when you get into Sacramento in CAL FIRE, most of the people that are there in a uniform are at the end of their career. And I knew that I needed a plan. And there was 4 things that I really wanted to focus on. One was returning fire to our fire adapted ecosystems. The second was community wildfire preparedness and mitigation. The third was working on policy and legislation in a way that I couldn't when I was with the department. And the fourth was actually the biggest surprise to me, because I didn't expect it. And that was, how do we connect technology and innovation in a meaningful way to the fire service community and the wildfire community? Mm-hmm. And that fourth one actually was kind of a bit of an aha moment for me when I sat down with Bill Clerico from Convective Capital and Anna Kulakina, who's also a partner with Convective, but also the co-founder and CEO of BurnBot, in Sacramento with our deputy director of technology. And I saw for the first time, I saw this venture capital that was coming into the wildfire space and people that were bringing solutions that we hadn't seen before. And both Bill and Anna Cool had already built successful companies and sold those companies, but both had been impacted by wildfire in the 2017, 2018 timeframe. And they were just, symbolic of this much larger group of people that also saw this problem and realized that they could make a difference as well. And so Anacool was actually very helpful to me as I transitioned out of CAL FIRE and understanding that private space, because it's really easy just to disappear after retirement or go do the safe thing, which could be just go work for another fire department. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to try to stay true to those 4 things that I really was passionate about. And Anacool was very helpful in helping me navigate that space from public into the private space. And so now I'm advising for some private companies, including Burnbot, Fireside, Rain, doing some work with an insurance company called Rockrose Risk, and then working with UC San Diego on some really innovative projects. They're amazing at UC San Diego, the work that they do there. And then working through the Climate and Wildfire Institute with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Wildfire Resilience Initiative, which is just phenomenal group of people. And then I think it's almost like obligatory that you end up on some boards after you retire. So asked to be on the California Fire Safe Council board of directors behind Bob Roper when he stepped out. And then we just stood up a nonprofit called Earthfire Alliance, which is the nonprofit that is working to deploy FireSat.
So let's start with that. Tell us about Earthfire Alliance and FireSat. What are those?
Sure. So when I was working as the chief deputy director for the department, CAL FIRE, Cal OES, and the California National Guard, we went to Cal OES and we got kind of pitched on this FireSat concept. And it was Kate Dargan Marquez and George Whitesides and a whole bunch of really smart people that told us their vision for FireSat. And I was sitting there in this presentation and understanding that it's a global system that they're standing up. I realized that if California wasn't willing to engage in FireSat and understand what it is, that someone else would. And I wanted California to be part of this early adopter process that they were talking about. And so we executed an MOU between CAL FIRE and FireSat Management LLC, which is a subsidiary of the Environmental Defense Fund, to begin that process of understanding, what this relationship looks like. But I had absolutely no intention that it would be something that I would still be a part of after my time with CAL FIRE. And through that evolution of the program, it is now transitioned over to Earthfire Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization. And FireSat is being supported by philanthropic funds. So the Moore Foundation, Google.org, Minderoo Foundation, and then some other very generous philanthropic funders that choose to remain anonymous, which I think is just incredible. Ultimately, between, the first satellite will launch in 2025. It'll be a prototype, 3 more in 2026. Those launch dates are already secured and paid for. And then between 2027 and 2029, the plan is to deploy an additional 48 satellites for a total of 52, which will give us a global revisit rate of anywhere between 15 to 20 minutes for every fire globally.
Wow.
I mean, I think this is really going to be game-changing for the fire community to have access to this kind of data. It'll have 80-meter resolution. It'll be able to detect 5-meter hotspots. It's a sun-synchronous orbit. And right now, we are working with the state of California, Colorado, New South Wales. We're in discussions with Portugal right now and trying to find some different early adopters that can really help inform the system. And the system is designed for first responders. I mean, that's the whole core of the project, is building something that is going to be useful to those that are responding to these fires and really being able to understand them in a different way. And ultimately, also to be able to perhaps even change the way that we respond to these fires, because we'll have a fidelity and a granularity of what's happening that we've never had before. And I think about the times when we've had literally hundreds of fires burning simultaneously in the state of California. You get these lightning events that come through, and there really was not good visibility on all these fires that were burning simultaneously, and how that would have influenced our response and our strategy and our tactics. And, it's really going to be a game-changing technology.
Yeah, seriously. Satellite imagery, satellite data with that kind of return rate globally. That's amazing. And so that's Earth Fire Alliance's primary responsibility right now, is making sure this FireSat program gets implemented successfully.
It is.
That's pretty wild. Okay, so what is a Fire Safe Council then? You had said that as well. Tell us, a lot of people who are listening or watching probably don't have experience with a Fire Safe Council. What is it?
So there's a number of Fire Safe Councils in California. And think of them as grassroots organizations that are driving wildfire resilience at the community level. And there is a California Fire Safe Council. And the California Fire Safe Council really works to support the local fire safe councils throughout California, and also act as a pass-through entity for a lot of state and federal grants, and to be able to drive, different programs forward. And CAL FIRE and the California Fire Safe Council have enjoyed a relationship for decades, and that's been a really, really close relationship. But we know that there is no one organization or entity that can do everything themselves, right? We need everyone to participate in driving towards a resilient future. And in many cases, it is neighbors helping neighbors, and local community members working with the people in their neighborhoods that are actually making big differences in the way that communities are preparing for wildfire. And so it's working to support those local fire safe councils. Many of these people that are doing this work don't come from a fire background at all. They're just passionate about their communities and protecting their communities. And it's important that we get them the support and the resources that they need to be able to do that work, and also be available to provide that guidance that they need as well.
So your post-retirement plan, which clearly is pretty well thought out at this point, had 4 elements. You get to work with all the way from community members on the ground to the satellite system. That's a pretty broad scope you've got. Chris, that's pretty impressive. Kevin, I can tell you're chomping at the bit.
It doesn't really sound like retirement to me, which is kind of awesome. But yeah,
Lucky for us.
I know.
Lucky for us, right?
There's, 100 things I want to dive into, but granted, we are somewhat strapped for time. But you mentioned earlier about just the resource management, and we initially had a conversation about all things water and fire and land. And I think that we're going through this evolution right now where it's not necessarily always thinking about fighting fire, but managing fire, living with fire. And you've worked all across all different entities, but now working with some of these startups and the Earth Fire Alliance. How, with using new technologies, as well as also kind of continue to think about lifestyle evolution from just general homeowners to businesses, how, and also just using these new technology data tools that are giving us better insights, how are those helping us better live with fire, manage fire, not just trying to fight fire?
It's a great question. So ultimately, I firmly believe that there's this painful duality with fire. We have way too much of it at high severity throughout the Western United States and many other places. Yet we need a lot more of it at low to moderate severity as a long-term management tool, understanding that these landscapes have had fire in them for, hundreds of thousands of years. In order to be able to more effectively and more safely manage getting more fire onto the ground, we have to do a couple things. So the first is, many of our landscapes aren't even ready for us to return fire to them. They're just so overstocked, overdense. There's too many fuels. It's simply not safe just to go reintroduce fire into those landscapes. And so that's where I see companies like BurnBot coming in, right? BurnBot was really initially founded on the concept of scaling prescribed fire, which was the development of the RX2 prescribed fire robot, until Aniko Lakina realized that in order to actually get fire in many of these places, there needed to be a lot of pretreatment that was done. And so he scaled this whole fuels reduction forestry side of BurnBot. So one is preparing the landscapes for more fire. The second is preparing communities through public education and outreach to understand that there is a difference between good smoke and bad smoke. And prescribed fire, which is much less intense, gives much fewer emissions and impacts over time than, these massive conflagrations that we're seeing. The third is we need better tools for our practitioners to know what's going to happen before they put fire on the ground. And that's where I think UC San Diego comes into play with BurnPro 3D, which is a three-dimensional fire modeling tool. It's a physics-based coupled fire atmospheric tool that allows practitioners to develop a custom drip torch ignition pattern and essentially see what's going to happen in a three-dimensional model before they put fire on the ground. And the reason I think that's important is because we've lost a lot of the historical knowledge on prescribed fire. We used to do a lot of it, and then there was a period of time that very little prescribed fire happened, and now we're asking people to do a lot more of it. And so if we have models that help practitioners understand what's going to happen before they put fire on the ground, that gets them to yes a lot quicker. So, and then FireSat. I think FireSat, if we can understand the fire intensity of unplanned ignitions and how they're burning, the question is, could we change the way that we respond to those fires based on not only what the models are showing and what the fire is currently doing, but, using kind of a new approach to allow some of these fires to actually burn more acres at lower intensity and essentially let these unplanned ignitions do some work for us. And granted, you have to make sure that you're doing it at times of the year that it's safe when you have the resource availability to do it. But I do think that we can use our fire protection system to be able to get more acres burned at lower severity, whether it's a planned or unplanned ignition in a safe way. And then finally, you also have to have policy and legislation in place to be able to scale prescribed fire. And I'll give you an example. So in the state of California, we just had SB 1101 pass that essentially exempts CAL FIRE from the public contracting code for implementing prescribed fire projects throughout the state of California and the work that needs to be done to prepare those landscapes. The reason that's important is because you need to cut red tape and get through bureaucratic hurdles in order to scale prescribed fire. And so, as we see kind of these building blocks being put into place and thinking about like a department like CAL FIRE, which has a significant amount of resources that we use for fire suppression, we can also use those resources for prescribed fire and getting more beneficial fire on the landscape. And that's the shift that we need to go. If we don't change the way that we respond, we will continue to see these large and damaging fires. And that is not the future that I want to see for, our future personnel, because it affects everyone. It's not just CAL FIRE, it's local, it's state, it's federal. I mean, we're all in this together, and it is having impacts throughout the fire service.
One smaller follow-on question, but it's obviously you could probably talk about this for an hour, but you touched on satellites and Earth Fire Alliance. That's with Karen O'Connor, correct?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I had the fortune of having her on the podcast down at AFAC a couple months ago. But she was telling me about the rise of satellites, and we were talking yesterday about satellites and just kind of not, a lot of times it maybe seem a bit nebulous, like there's just these like floating objects in the sky that are equipped with cameras or sensors, and then it's sort of thinking about, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that translate to in terms of any useful, actionable information that allows me to make a more informed decision, to allow me to have data that I did not have before? Kind of from a high level and super pragmatic level, like what are the satellites that are going to be deployed in the next 5 years going to allow us to make better informed decisions from a fire ground and living with fire perspective?
So I can so vividly remember. So CAL FIRE currently uses satellite imagery from FireGuard, which is essentially declassified Department of Defense satellites that run from Department of Defense to the California Military Department. Those images get declassified and then they get put into CAL FIRE's Common Operating Picture, which is TechnoSilva. I can remember the first time I got that data in response to a fire as I was going to a fire. And I, on my phone, I was able to see where the perimeter of the fire was. And this was like a really long response time for me to this fire. And I could see which community was going to be impacted. And then it also gave me metrics on how many people were in that community, what the time was. And you could see the model in terms of like, it's going to impact the community in this many hours. And it was such a significant moment for me to see that. And I wasn't even there at the fire to begin thinking about what that response was going to look like. So with FireSat doesn't replace other observation technology that we have in place, whether it's AI-enabled cameras or technologies like the Fire Integrated Real-Time Information System, which is the 2 aircraft in California that give us great intelligence on initial attack fires. But what it will do is it will give us early detection. So it'll be part of the early detection system. It will give us a measurement of fire radiative power, which is a measure of fire intensity to help us understand not only how intense the fire is burning, but it also helps with the recovery side of fires as well. If you know how intense a fire has burned, you have a better understanding of what those post-fire impacts are going to be. It'll give you, obviously, the perimeter of the fire. And then you can start actually better informing the fire spread models that are being used to tell us what the fire is going to do in the next, 1, 2, 3, 8 hours. And these fire spread models, if they have access to this data on a 15 or 20 minute revisit rate, those models can then adjust in ways that they can't right now because they're able to, take what actually happened and then the model can change to better predict what's going to happen over time. And then also alerting. So with our phones and everything else that we have electronically attached to us, obviously there will be those alerts that will come in. And so what I see also is for an incident commander or for a first responder or our command centers, before anyone even gets to that fire, they are going to be so much better informed on what it's doing, the direction that it's going, what the models are saying, what the response strategy is going to be, how to initiate evacuations sooner. It's just going to be a level of intelligence that we haven't had before. And also keeping in mind that I'm speaking within the context of California. And so you think about those areas of the globe that don't have access to the types of technologies that we have in California, but will now have access to this. And we'll also be able to start measuring global emissions much better, understanding at a global scale what's happening. I was, Dr. Lori yesterday was talking about how we are undercounting the number of civilian fatalities as a result of a fire in the nation. And we probably don't really fully understand or appreciate the impacts of wildfire at a global scale. And we know that it's like dramatically rising. This is not like a California problem anymore, or a Western states problem. It is such a global problem. And I think we're going to finally have the opportunity to really understand how significant the challenge is ahead of us. And yet the community continues to grow, and the partnerships are just remarkable, the people who are coming into this space to solve this problem.
That made the nebulous pretty practical. That's impressive. So make a connection for us here. You had talked about it in a couple of the answers you gave, and the bits you're talking about. For some of us, it's not as clear. It's obvious it's become clear to you. There's a connection between groups like CAL FIRE, an organization that has a lot of resources, our fire departments, private industry, and philanthropy. And whether it's the Moore Foundation, where you and I met, you want to use them as an example, or in general, philanthropy, how do they fit into this future? What do they provide?
I'll be perfectly honest. I did not understand how philanthropic organizations worked or what the work of the Moore Foundation was until I met with Kate Dargan Marquez and Jenny Biggs and Marion, and really began to understand more about what the Moore Foundation was doing, and meeting with you at the Wildfire Advisory Council meeting in San Francisco. I realized that philanthropy can de-risk things in a way that public funding can't, and even in some respects in ways that venture capital or private equity can't. they are such an innovative group of people with not only a vision for wildfire resilience 50 years from now, but a really well thought out strategy of how we get there to, crossing from, interventions at the ecosystem level, interventions at the community level, and then the early fire interventions like FireSat, and then these cross-cutting kind of strategies as part of each one of those to drive those forward. And then really being true to that mission in terms of what it is that they're funding and why they're funding those things. And yet being open at the same time to work with people like us and ask our opinions on the strategy. But what I really appreciate about the Moore Foundation is that they are in this for all of the right reasons. And they are able to do things that no other organization is capable of doing. Many of the activities that I'm involved with actually have been or are being supported by the Moore Foundation. And so, clearly they're making really good decisions about the things that they're making their investments into and trying to de-risk and push forward. And so, philanthropy is just such a remarkable process to be a part of.
De-risking. That's awesome. Here we go, man. Last question. This could be an hour-long answer too, because I think you have a lot to be proud of. What makes you the most proud?
So I'm really glad that you asked me that question. I'm actually most proud that I am still married and have an amazing wife. I think about like how much time and effort and energy we all put into what we do, and how much things have changed over the last 20 to 30 years in the fire service and the demands on the fire service. And everyone is giving so much of themselves to serving others that it can be really hard to maintain relationships. And so I am very proud that, I'm still happily married, and I'm very thankful that my kids are doing amazing. And because there are, I think there are regrets, in terms of the time that's spent at work versus the time that's spent at home and with the family. And, understanding that those impacts are really across the board when it comes to public safety and the demands on our public servants. So I'm very mindful of that. And that's what I'm really proud of.
Definitely something for which you should be proud. We're proud to have had you on. Thank you for joining us, Chris Anthony.
Thank you.
We are certain you enjoyed hearing from those who are doing great things in the wildland-urban interface, and hope maybe you even learned a little something new. If you have a story to share, please reach out to us. In the meantime, we thank you for listening to Wildfire Chronicles, Heroism Beyond the Flames. We'll see you next time.